The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm Charles Christian, I'm your host, and thank you very much for joining me. We've got a big interview coming up where we're going to be covering everything from science fiction movies, Eric von Daniken and Chariots of the Gods, the Beatles, and even Aleister Crowley. All about the 1960s. More of that later. But before we kick off, here's a little bit of light news. Those of you in England will be aware, possibly, of the town of Chesterfield in Derbyshire, where the parish church, St Mary's and All Saints, is famous for its crooked spire. If you've never seen it before, it's got a twist in it, so it looks a little bit like a corkscrew. Now, the boring explanation for it is that when it was built, green timber was used, and there was also a lack of cross-bracing in the spire. It was then clad with lead, which meant that the southern side, which was nearest to the sun, or the side pointing to the sun most of the year, expanded at a different rate to the northern side, and on top of the unseasoned timber, it caused it to twist. That's the boring explanation. There are, however, two legends to explain it. One involves our old friend the devil, who makes regular appearances in this show, and the legend has it that the devil was in the nearby town of Bolsover, and he was having his hooves reshod. Yes, who knew that the devil required iron shoes nailing to his feet? Anyway, the blacksmith doing the job accidentally nailed right into the sole of his foot, and the pain made the devil leap through the air, high in the air, and passing over Chesterfield, he grabbed onto the church tower to break his fall, and as a result twisted it. The alternative version says that a virgin was once married in the church, and the building was so surprised that the spire turned around to look at the bride. The second part of the legend says that if another virgin from Chesterfield marries in the church, the spire will straighten up again. Well, it's had a twisted spire for 800 years, so we'll gloss over the ladies of Chesterfield. Now, on with the show. And now for our big interview, where we're talking to Tobias Churton about his new book, The Spiritual Meaning of the Sixties, the Magic, Myth and Music of the Decade That Changed the World. Who's Tobias Churton? Well, as he commented to me that if he had to write a CV nowadays, it'd have to be published in hardback because he's done so many things. He's widely regarded as the leading British authority on Western Esotericism. He's an authority on Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. He's an honorary fellow of Exeter University, and his many books include Occult Paris, Aleister Crowley in America, the book we're going to be talking about today, and he has a new book on Aleister Crowley coming out later this year. Yes, here's the details of the 2017 Crowley book, get my pronunciation right. Aleister Crowley in America, Art, Espionage and Sex Magic in the New World. Sounds a page-turner to me. It's my great pleasure to be talking to Tobias Churton, the author of, came out the end of last year, of The Spiritual Meaning of the Sixties, the Magic, Myth and Music of the Decade That Changed the World. Now, Tobias, could you give a brief overview of, if you like, the big picture of the book, what you're attempting to achieve with it? And what I say, I thoroughly enjoyed and you do achieve.
Yeah, I think all my life I've heard people talk about the 60s as a period of special meaning to them personally. And very often the stress has been on a certain quality, might have been in the music, might have been in the atmosphere, might have been in people's experience, but a certain spiritual interest and flavor to the thing. And I've often wondered how one would define it. But I think the thing that launched the big picture was my daughter, when she was in her mid-teens, started collecting, without any prompting from me, records by the Byrds, Rolling Stones, Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, and so on, and which was fairly contrary to what her own generation were listening to at the time. And she got interested in vinyl, and she kept saying things like, "Oh God, I wish I'd been born then." So she seemed to be suffering from a certain 60s envy, and I suffer from it too, because I'd like to go back there in many ways myself, because rather like certain experiences you've had, you want to repeat them because they're so special or glorious, and memory fades, but it was wonderful. And I wanted to do a book that was really for my daughter's generation, actually, and for successive generations of young people, so they'd get a very full picture or investigation of this issue of what was truly, at its deepest and highest level, what was special about the 1960s. And the more I got into the issue, it wasn't simply a question of saying, well, the music had more chords or something, or more invention or more genius was about. It was, I decided to take on the whole issue of what we would mean even by, what do we mean by spiritual meaning at all? So there's a couple of chapters at the beginning, which you can skip, really for the skeptics who would say that nothing has, the word spiritual has no essential referent. And if it does, what the hell do you mean by spiritual meaning? And how can you talk about the spiritual meaning of a period of history anyway? So I give some examples of where people in the past have actually, I was thinking of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, who did an account of the spiritual meaning of the French Revolution, which he wrote well in its immediate aftermath. And he talks about what France had sort of generated spiritually before to make this event, regrettable as it was in so many, many, many ways, what it made it inevitable and ultimately meaningful. And then I thought, well, you can't just deal with the general culture. I wanted to look at everything: theology, politics, current affairs, what I call the great plastic fantastic space race, the whole ethos of the period in which I grew up, from Fireball XL5 to the Apollo missions to all the NASA developments to the increase in plasticity in society. Then I wanted to talk about the cinema, visual arts, sculpture, painting, music, orchestral music, jazz music, pop music. And I want to talk about the cultural influences, literary things, and so on. So, but each one looked at specifically through this lens of its spiritual meaning. Now, this is a very difficult thing to pin down. God is not an object of our knowing, and spiritual things are spiritually discerned, as St. Paul says. So it requires a certain amount of insight to say anything about the spiritual meaning of anything at all. But somehow the 60s as a decade, the more, however different views I took the picture from, consistently yielded spiritual meaning. And so the book is really a harvest of all of that systematically, and I'm told through partly through my own eyes. There's far more autobiographical material in the book than I've ever put into any other book, only because it was of great assistance. I mean, a lot of the things I talked about I remember happening, and seen through the eyes of a child, which I say is as valid as any other eyes. So I say my 60s experience is equally as valid as anybody else's. But I've also had some advantages since then of meeting people. For example, I did a film for the BBC about John Lennon, and I got to speak to all sorts of people: Roy Orbison, Roger Waters of Pink Floyd. I got to know Derek Taylor, the Beatles press officer, when he was at Apple and earlier for Epstein. And that was a tremendous insight, because he had a spiritual insight himself, and he recognized that the Beatles did authentically represent a spiritual view of the world. So the book for me was a magical mystery tour, and I wanted to take the skin off it and remove the very false idea that a lot of young people get today, that it was all peace, love, floral shirts, and a lot of understanding and so forth. And of course, the psychedelic movement was really a very, very small part, and you had to be extremely privileged to get any inkling of it, except a few minutes on Top of the Pops in the late 60s and Sunday newspapers, which forever complaining about hippies and the scantily dressed girls and stuff like that. Actually, in many respects, visually, it was a very conservative era.
Yes.
By our standards, by the scruffy standards of 2019, where people commonly walk around in dress which would have been very much confined to the private places.
Yes.
Back in the 60s, and men wore hats and suits. And
yes,
I loved in Australia in the mid 60s. It was wonderful to see how fresh and smart people could look, because you don't see it anymore.
Yes. I've got a lot of 60s vinyl, and you look at the album covers and you have the Stones and the Beatles and the Pretty Things, who everybody thought were really terrible, and they're all wearing shirts with ties and suit jackets. It's
Yes, they were. There had to be a certain amount of access before the record companies would let the band get in reach of the adolescents.
Yes, and I say they
who were.
Yeah, the long-haired lover from Liverpool type of thing. Their hair's quite short. Shorter than yours.
Yes. But shock is relative.
Yes.
I mean, when skirts went above the knee in the 20s, that was shocking. When you could see ankles of ladies in the Edwardian era, that was shocking. So it's not a question of length. It's the degree of liberty which has been advanced or been provocative. And the 60s, I mean, people who had long hair in the 60s, many of them suffered very badly for it. It wasn't just a style choice. They had to fight for it. And I think David Bowie first reached public notice as a teenager, advocating long hair, and for which he was suffering opprobrium and problems at school, and people were sent home. And my father certainly would drag me down to the barber's, and out came the razor, where if there was any infraction upon military haircut. So that to have long hair, I mean, I also, publisher of the book, I remember we talked about when he was growing up in New York, was beaten up in Brooklyn for having long hair. These people pioneered liberties which are now taken for granted. So it wasn't a free and easy period at all. There was painful struggle going on. And again, what is enlivening that? What is giving people the consciousness that these things are worth striving for? What's coming through? What is the spirit of the age, or the spirits of the age? It was not a very materialistic time for young people, because they didn't have much matter to be materialistic with.
No.
But on the other hand, the dreams of the general masses in the Western world in the 60s were highly influenced by the post-war rise of standard of living in the United States, which had an enormous effect on certainly people in this country. And when Macmillan drew attention to the improvement in standards of living in the late 50s by the 60s.
Yes.
Well, of course, he never said that. But anyway, that's why I was choosing my words. But that kind of idea, he's really saying that, look, we will catch up with America, honest, sometime. But most people, you've got all that going on. But these issues, spiritual issues, became much more acute in the United States than they ever did in Britain in the 60s. There you had a much greater divide between the people who were quite satisfied with the post-war American situation and people who were dissatisfied. And that was a very small number to start with, but it made a hell of a difference. And of course, the media was expanding its electronic grasp on us in that period. So you got to hear all these things were magnified. So that was another aspect of the period, was the degree of magnification of events and things. It became possible to have a large effect by doing a small thing.
Yeah. One particular section I was interested in, part 3, the chapter on the discomforting changes in theology, chapter 11, isn't it? And
yes, so that's an important thing for people to realize, that in the 60s religion was important still. The Bible was a persistent part of the culture, general culture. I don't just mean signed up members of believing churches. That's a thing that's very often overlooked, and certainly by the modern media, are not at all interested in these things and pretend they never happened. But the 60s was full of commentary from concerned religious people, whether bishops or private individuals. And I mean, the whole Mary Whitehouse thing starts as a Christian organization, specifically Christian organization. There's all that going on. But there were other things, more profound attempts by theologians to, they thought, modernize or catch up, most of which, as far as I can see, have misfired terribly.
It was in the 60s, was it then we had the New English Bible that came out?
Yes, that I refer to that, and I give some quotes about, they really thought that if you it's very much like the BBC today with this dumbing down nonsense. They think if you reduce the intellectual content of a thing, you somehow make it inclusive. Yes, well, you make a wider pool of something you don't want to belong to. So it's not inclusive. It in fact discludes the very, you see what I'm saying? It's actually a reductionism. And the abandonment of excellent Shakespearean early 17th century English, the finest English prose we will ever achieve, probably in many respects, in favor of the bluntest, crassest form of literal translation from the Koine Greek. Well, it gives you things like, I remember the thing as he who tries to save his life will lose it. The word soul is translated as real self or something like this. I mean, it just starts more questions than it answers. Real self? What's that? Which self? And so on. Anyway, it was a pretty useless exercise, in my opinion, and it totally failed to see that religion doesn't become more relevant by making it more contemporary. The relevance of religion is that it is its timelessness. And it is precisely because a Russian peasant was able, if they were fortunate in the 60s, to go into even one of the state-approved religious temples as they called them, and experience a little bit of the liturgy. That gave them an idea that they were not bound to the general imprisonment that they were experiencing outside. And so religion has a function to introduce people to eternity. Now, while the churches were trying to introduce people to the contemporary as if they needed it, it then fell to Indian religion and the popularization or limited popularization of Vedanta and Advaita philosophy from India, promoted by George Harrison and Mahesh, the yogi from Rishikesh, and the Krishna movement and Ravi Shankar and so on. They were kind of filling the spiritual void that the church was willingly or unwillingly, arguably, leaving us with. And that's created a lasting and continual movement, which we still see all the time. Go into any self-help bookshop and you will have now, everyone has heard the word karma, nirvana, all of this stuff, and people will talk about those things as being spiritual, whereas they would say organized religion is not so spiritual and or so individual. So that was a very important development which needed looking at and making clear to people. So I actually explained the differences between the various schools of Indian thought, which are never explained. It's all lumped together.
Yes.
Hinduism, and so I sort of break that down in terms that people can grasp exactly what the different schools were saying and why they were actually arguing with each other. I mean, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was roundly ridiculed by the founder of the Krishna movement and said he has no authority for these things, and so on and so on. I mean, so you almost had the importation of interscholar maleficence, if you like, that exists in India all the time. I mean, it's very difficult to get two pundits to agree on anything in India.
Yes.
But George Harrison had the genius for making it into a song that everyone could get something off, even if it was just something mysterious, best heard through the mist of a joss stick.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Just continuing on from that, the 60s was also the era, and again it's in that same chapter where you're talking about John Mitchell, who is now, best known for the View Over Atlantis and the ley lines concept. And we also had a big surge in interest in the, I know he's nowadays regarded as a bit of a fraud, but Eric von Daniken and the Chariot of the Gods, which came out in 1968 and so on. The whole Pink Floyd set the controls for the Heart of the Sun and the UFO Club thing. Was that, as you think, as a result of the space race that people were more interested in it? Or why did we suddenly start looking to the stars and thinking there was something out there?
Very, very fascinating set of questions are involved in that inquiry. And obviously science fiction as a mode of literature had been developing specifically since the 1940s. Mm-hmm. The comic culture, which goes back further than that, was coming from America to this country and was getting a lot of young people aware of strange scientific dreams of scientific states, scientific-like or techno superior conditions that could conceivably operate. And with that comes also the corresponding notion that did our ancestors know more about this than we did? Now, obviously, it was von Daniken took his ideas from another Frenchman's book, which was about based on Genesis chapter 6, which is the Nephilim.
Yes.
Why does it all I think the thing is all these things were there in the 50s, but they
was that Robert Charroux?
Robert Charroux's book. I'm trying to think of the title of it. Yeah.
The Book of Betrayed Secrets? The
Book of Betrayed Secrets, yeah. I mean, that's what Daniken is. In fact, he had to mention that book in the second edition because otherwise he'd have been sued by the publishers. And that was popularized in the Tintin book, which I remember getting when it came out, Flight 714 for Sydney, where Tintin arrives on this island in Indonesia, and you have the exact combination of the futuristic flying saucers plus the ancient civilization gods thing. Again, this is very deep beginnings, but again we're seeing a vacuum in public religious life being filled with scientific fantasies, but the realization of those fantasies becoming reality becomes, of course, much more acute in the 60s, and the reason why the 60s are such a decade, almost the decade of decades, it's almost like if there was a thing called decadism, this would be the ideal one, is because President Kennedy made the statement in 62, by the end of the decade, we will put it's America's intention to put a man on the moon, and this shapes the entire period in very profound ways. Not only does it give the pure time slice tremendous thrust, and it's an upward thrust. It's going into realms that were very only recently thought to be the realm of the angels, and there was disquiet that this cosmic order and the supernal powers which some people believe govern the universe might be upset by the pinprick of these Saturn V rockets penetrating the thin skin of the Earth's atmosphere and going into where no man has gone before.
Yeah, just to
except
interrupt.
Presumably Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
No, you can't interrupt. I haven't finished. I'm going to finish my point. This is this shape that it gives the 60s brings all this other stuff out rather like a fire in a grate. The more you put on it, it starts to float up and coalesce in the chimney and create something very dense, which comes out the other end. So yeah, the space race has a massive psychological effect, because you can see these things as being not merely in a comic book, but they're right in your eyes. You may now interfere.
No, it was just I do recall, how certain memories stick in the mind. Reading a piece in the Sunday Express back in the 60s, and it was a bishop saying how rockets might accidentally crash into heaven, and it was a strange image. But
yeah, well, it's a perfectly valid view. It was, I say it was perfectly valid by the theological level. The stars were regarded as having angelic governors. And the moon, everyone heard of the man in the moon. So there was we had anthropomorphized the universe. We had made it human. We'd given all these disparate relationships of stars, human conceptions or animal similes. And the universe had already been populated by our imagination for thousands of years. And it was that was going to be disturbed, of course, by the presence of science, knocking in rather like a bull in a china shop into established faith, the faith in the universe. I think of the first scene of A Matter of Life and Death, the Powell and Pressburger movie, 1946, which begins in outer space as on the night of 1944, if I remember right. Anyway, there's a bombing raid going on in Berlin. No, maybe it was 45. Anyway, the point is you get the God's eye view from outer space, and then you come closer to the Earth. Outside there is order and a divine system, and only on Earth is this sweeping of evil going on, this terrible war, and so on and so forth, into which individuals are swept and then swept out. And it is presumed that when you try it in heaven, you're going to leave the Earth. And there's even if you remember right, a staircase which goes right across space.
Yes.
Right across space through the stars. So the bishop was really talking about the way people imagined the afterlife, the judgment, and the God's eye view. Now, by going into space, we are acquiring the God's eye view. And look what we got. We got the first ever clear view of the planet as a separate entity, and that psychological effect of that has been absolutely immense, enormous. And now, of course, it's become a commonplace. Yeah. But look at the disquiet it's led to, the worry about climate change and being hit by asteroids and all the rest of it. Our place in the universe is no longer taken for granted. And it's probably had as many, evil, produced more bad dreams than good. I think when it first happened, it all seemed good because we thought, oh my God, now we've seen that, we can see what we're fighting about. Isn't it absurd? Where are the lines between, where are the walls between nations when we see the Earth from outer space? We see it as a whole. We see it as a beautiful marbled orb, the work of millions of years of who knows what levels of evolution and all the rest of whatever mythology you choose to explain its iridescence. But suddenly we've appeared to have interfered with everything.
Yes.
Now this is a direct result of the space missions. Now, it's very much like the preponderance of ghosts. Now, you'll notice if you're interested in ghosts and this sort of thing, that not always, I know, but they're poltergeists. But the classic ghost happens in a house that's been left derelict and is then re-explored. And it is the violation, apparently, of a place that seemed, at least to the ghost, the spirit of the place, was once a living thing, that outsiders in another time enter and by violating that space, the ghost is disquieted and may haunt or show its displeasure. Rarely do the ghosts say, "Hi, I'm so lonely in this rotten old hall in Norfolk."
Yes.
Nice to see you. It's always disquieting.
Yes.
And of course, terrifying for people who insist on spending the night in these places.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
So there is the sense of a violation, but that wasn't apparent in the 60s. It was only a few people who raised that level of disquiet. I think for most people, they thought there was something actually God-given about the whole. And of course, when America went into space, they went with the Bible. And I remember very well Christmas Eve 1968, magnificent rendering of the Genesis by the astronaut who was on the other side of, or about to go on the other side of the moon. It was quite incredible to hear the cosmic God's eye view spoken by a human being from, further than any human being had ever been from the Earth that we were supposed to be staying on. Yes. And looks like we probably still will.
Yes.
So the lack of the earthboundness of man is being disturbed in the 60s. Now, this has got to have spiritual implications, and inevitably, because it's an undermining of our fundamental historic sensorium of what we've taken reality, the earth beneath our feet, and so on. I mean, it had been predicted by people like H.G. Wells. Jules Verne had suggested that going into the bowels of the Earth, journey to the center of the Earth, or going into outer space would have strange effects, but nobody knew what they would be. And I think people are still very naive about how much of today's psychology is actually shaped by these events. And I'm particularly thinking of the Green Movement, which is a clear child of the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thinking about it, the whole ecology thing was really then that it first started.
Yes, because you're starting to think of the Earth in terms of its fragility, its vulnerability, and its objectivity. So that until you've seen that picture taken of the Earth rising, as it were, from with the moon inside, before it, until you've seen the Earth as a separate entity, literally another world, you don't grasp the magnitude of what the green message is getting at, or thinks it's getting at. We have been shown a vision. It may as well have come from God to a prophet, but it's a vision. We've been given a new vision of Earth, and we've asked for it, literally. And we literally gone out and said, okay, give it to us. And we got it straight. And the result is, for many people, is that they're frightened. Now, that's a real change, and that's, I think, has a lot to do with what happened to the 60s towards its end, and then how the 70s kind of started to paste over the period, strangely, almost like it never happened. Even to the extent you've got very curious bods today obsessed with the idea that man never went to the moon.
Yes, the whole moon landing conspiracy theory.
Yeah. It's like it's a conspiracy, isn't it? It's very strange, this development of the conspiratorial. Amazing how. I mean, I thought the whole essence of conspiracy was meant to be secret, but how do these people know about it? If there's a conspiracy, my dears, you don't know about it. A good conspiracy, a powerful one, you wouldn't know it was going on. That's what would make it truly terrifying. That was, of course, played with in the 60s in series like The Invaders. I don't know if that was shown in England. It was shown in Australia. It was an American series where the aliens have actually taken over, or gradually taken over, the government of the world. Now, it's clearly a metaphor when they made the series. Quinn Martin Productions made it. It was a metaphor, obviously, for communism. Was the idea that you had secret communists everywhere, but instead of talking about communists, they used the idea of the alien.
Yes.
Who's taking over, who looks like you and me. He acts like you and me, but he isn't like you and me. He's actually going to demolish and destroy the human experience.
And Captain Scarlet and the Mysterions, that was the same concept. We then, just looking at it, where it then starts merging with, I suppose, more modern or more esoteric thought. Again, we're going back to John Mitchell here, But in one of his books was Flying Saucer Vision, The Holy Grail Restored, View Over Atlantis.
He's the prophet. He's the prophet of the period.
Yeah.
He's the prophet. His influence has been so enormous, John Michel, that it's almost difficult to assess because it's spread abroad. I remember my best friend from Holland first came to England because he wanted to go to Glastonbury. Now, you don't go to, if you're a Dutchman, you're living out in the countryside in Holland, how the heck did you get excited about Glastonbury?
Yes.
In the 70s.
Yes.
Well, of course, it's all the result. I know John Michel is not alone, but I think he spearheads it, certainly from London. And his dreams of an integrated gnosis encompassing astrology, UFOs, William Blake, Glastonbury, the whole thing, Holy Grail, all of that is people are very loath to let go of that. That whole vision of strange goings on. I mean, you had it back in the 90s with the corn, the shapes in the corn
circle.
And so on.
Yes, corn circles. Yes,
it was all started again, or seemed to start again, or emerged again. And you then blend that with Wicca, and so on. You get your neo-pagan.
Well, again, in the 60s was when Wicca started to come out into the open more. I'm thinking of
in the Sunday papers, at least. Anyway.
Well, it was, yes.
I wouldn't say yes. It wasn't in the open. You didn't get public celebrations of witches, and I don't think, in fact, it's in the open much now either. When I think in the early 90s, if you went to various country festivals like the Abbots Bromley Horn Dance in Staffordshire, for example, there'd be quite a strong Wiccan presence. But in fact, nowadays, and there was things called Pagan Link, and they would have collections of people, but there was extraordinary opposition to that. And my perception of it is that other than perhaps the West countries, a lot of that's gone very quiet now. There aren't many people who'd admit that they're bringing up their children as Wiccans and go to the local school. You know what I mean? Because
yes,
suspicion raised about the behavior of parents and so forth. I mean, all of that there was that bizarre case where the obsessive person up in the Orkneys or something accused the entire community.
Yes.
Devilish practices. I mean, the effect of all of that has been to drive that movement. This is just a footnote to what we're saying.
Yes.
But it isn't it's not like it's an obviously growing thing at the moment.
Yeah.
And also, I think the economic conditions have changed. It must be quite difficult to be a neo-pagan and earn your living in a bank or something.
Yes. And that's it. We're out of time. We'll be back next week with the second and concluding part of our interview with Tobias Churton. And until then, I've been doing a little looking up on the weird 18th century phenomenon of people who survived being judicially hanged. Now, this only makes sense if you realise that in those days most people went for the short drop, which basically meant you had a rope put round your neck and you stepped off a ladder. So you had a relatively little fall and normally died as a result of asphyxia. Not a pleasant way to go, but it's unlike the more recent method of the long drop where the rope snaps your neck. And we're looking at the saga of half-hanged Maggie. Yes, half-hanged. She was a poor woman called Margaret Dixon from Edinburgh. She was married but separated from her husband, and she was sentenced to be hanged for the crime of concealing pregnancy in the case of a dead child. I think this is a form of infanticide, and nowadays we recognise there is such a thing as postnatal depression, but of course in those days there wasn't. Anyway, after she'd been hung, she was taken down from the gallows, put in a coffin, at the gallows foot and carried off in a cart by her relatives to be interred at her parish church at Musselburgh, which is about 6 miles to the east of Edinburgh. On the way there, some surgeon apprentices stopped the cart before it left town, and in the course of it, they broke part of the roof of the coffin. If you are wondering why they were stopping it, is because, of course, this was Burke and Hare territory, and apprentice surgeons were always looking for bodies that they could practice their dissection techniques upon. So they thought, here's a fresh one, we'll see if we can get it. Anyway, the cart continued on its way, but you'll notice because the roof of the coffin had been broken in, it let in air. And the subsequent jolting of the vehicle restored the victim to a point that by the time she'd got home, although hardly conscious and faint, she was definitely living. Her neighbours flocked around her in wonder. A church minister came to pray over her, and her separated husband relented, and they got back together again, and she lived many, many years after with several more children, all creditably born, as it says here. And people used to point out to her in the streets of Edinburgh where she lived, and they'd say, "There's half-hanged Maggie Dickinson." There's another tale here from Cork in Ireland, where a man was hanged for a robbery and immediately afterwards was carried off, where a surgeon who'd been called in by his family made an incision in his windpipe, which let in the air, and after about 6 hours, he was restored to full health, in fact, in such good condition that he was able to attend the theatre that same evening that he'd been sentenced to hang in the morning. Interesting times, though not one I think anyone would like to experience. Once again, thank you very much for listening. Hope you'll join us again next time. Until then, be well. Be weird, be different. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.